Continuing on in our study of the Sermon on the Mount, and like I mentioned last week, Jesus laid out what fulfilling the law, that he didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law, and then he launches into multiple examples of what that means exactly. And so this morning, if I were to ask you, have you kept the sixth commandment, which is thou shalt not murder, I think most of you in the room could say yes. That you know, this is one commandment, Dale, that we don't have to worry about. I've never killed anybody before, and I'm good on that one. And I wanted us to do the catechism this morning to kind of remind us that it means a lot more than just the literal thou shalt not murder. And the Pharisees, they were very literal in their interpretation and understanding of this rule. They looked at do not murder, and they're like, okay, check the box. I have not murdered anyone. Time to move on to the next thing. There's no dead bodies. There's no violation. It's just as simple as that. But here's the thing. Jesus doesn't let us off that easy. Jesus wants us to understand that this commandment was pointing to something deeper, pointing to something more than just the literal surface reading. And so if we're thinking like the Pharisees and the scribes, and they think, well, you know, we haven't put anybody 6 feet under, so we're good. We haven't messed this up. That's actually relaxing the commandment by failing to reach through to what God truly meant for us to take away from this commandment. And again, Jesus doesn't come to lower the bar at all. If anything, he's showing us how high the bar actually is in our life. And in these 6 verses, in Matthew 5, 21 through 26, he gives us 4 responsibilities. Each one is more demanding than the last. It's kind of like 4 steps up a mountain is kind of the way I was thinking about this week. It's an ascent, right? And that first step up the mountain is difficult, but the second step is even harder, the third step, and by the time you get to the top, you're winded, right? And so that's what Jesus is going to be showing us, and I'm going to kind of orient this sermon around these 4 steps that I think you're going to realize that some of us have got some real work to do when it comes to taking these steps. And let me kind of give you the big idea this morning, that disciples of Jesus are not passive avoiders of violence. They are active makers of peace, even when it costs them. Even when it costs them. So let's look at our text, Matthew 5, 21 through 26. He says, you have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So what are these 4 steps? Well, the first one is to stop the act. Verse 21. Jesus opens with the 6th commandment. And notice something really important here. The word is murder, not kill. There's a difference. It's not a minor distinction. One commentator noted that Jesus cites the 6th commandment. The correct rendering is murder, not kill. The Hebrew excluded killing in self-defense, wars, capital punishment, followed by due process of law, or accidental manslaughter. So Jesus isn't condemning soldiers. He's not condemning police officers or someone who's defending their family. This is about the unlawful taking of a life. And the Pharisees were fine with that. They said, hey, we don't murder people. We're good. But Jesus looks at them and he says, you're thinking about this all wrong. The Pharisees thought not murdering was the whole of the command, if you will. But Jesus doesn't set aside the prohibition of murder here. He's about to add to it. The sixth commandment is not the ceiling of Christian ethics. It's the floor of Christian ethics. We start there. We don't stop there. Make sense? So before we even get to anger or contempt for enemies, step one is just this. Don't murder people. The bar seems low, but Jesus is about to show us that most of us haven't even properly understood what this commandment is reaching toward. So step one, stop murdering people. Stop the act. Step two, stop the attitude. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult. Anger and contempt are murder in God's courtroom. Anger and contempt are the same as murder in God's courtroom. Because again, Jesus doesn't stop at the act. He goes straight to the attitude behind the act. What Jesus is calling us to, what the law should be calling us to, is a transformed heart. It's not just about an outward display of obedience. It's about an inward change to our heart. Another commentator noted, he says, whether murderers have white-hot rage or cool hatred, they are angry. If hatred leads to murder, then hatred is culpable too, even if it never leads to action. And this is where Jesus just absolutely destroys any self-righteousness you may have walked into the room this morning with. He says that being angry with your brother makes you liable to judgment. Calling someone raka, which is stupid idiot in the Aramaic, makes you answerable to the Sanhedrin. Calling someone a fool, and that word carries these overtones of morally worthlessness, right? Of being godless or just good for nothing, puts you in danger of the fire of hell. Now, some commentators have noticed a progression here in these three courtrooms, the local judgment, the Sanhedrin, and then Gehenna, or hell. But I think what he's trying to point out here is it's not really about three levels of sin getting worse. It's three ways of saying the same thing. That anger, contempt, name-calling, they all have the same root. They're all murder in the heart. And God judges them all. Anger that would generate murder, if unimpeded, is the spiritual equivalent of murder. God never wanted people merely to obey the rules. He wanted them to be as holy as He is and value what He values, and He values life. Most of us in this room have never pulled the trigger or even thrown a punch that led to someone's death. But most of us have called somebody an idiot under our breath. Maybe even this morning. On your way here driving. Most of us, if we're honest, have written somebody off in our life. We're just like, you know what? We've decided in our hearts that they are completely worthless. I'm not going to shed any tears. If they were to die tomorrow, so be it. All of us have probably done that this morning. Most of us, if calling somebody an idiot or fool, then most of us are murderers. Because almost every one of us has judged someone for being a fool or an idiot. And this is a hard word. Like I want you to feel the weight of what those first hearers must have been feeling in that moment, right? Because again, this is the one commandment that they thought, we are good. And this is Jesus' first illustration in this sermon. Let me explain to you how I fulfilled the law. You self-righteous bunch of people who think you've got it all together, this is what murder means. This is what this commandment was pointing to. Not just this literal, simple interpretation that you have made it, but what God is pointing to in all of the law. And for me, this isn't theoretical. When I'm sitting with people, talking to them, anger is one of the most common things sitting in the chair across from me when I meet with people. They are angry about something. They may be angry at God. They may be angry at themselves. They may be angry at their family. They may be angry at their mother or their father. They're all bearing anger in their heart, and they need to be made aware of God's estimate of their condition. They need to understand God, the way God views that unrighteous anger. You see, God views that unrighteous anger the same way He views murder. And they need to be aware of that. Now, I want to remind you that there is such a thing as righteous anger. Okay? All anger is not sinful. We know that because God gets angry. And God doesn't sin. Right? So there is a way in which to be righteously angry. Jesus himself got angry in the temple, right? He grieved over the hard hearts. But always notice the nature of Jesus' anger. Right? The Bible tells us that Jesus is what? Slow to anger. His anger was always for others, not himself. When they arrested him, when they mocked him, when they beat him, when they crucified him, he was as quiet as a lamb. Father, forgive them, he said, for they know not what they do. Our anger, though, is typically the exact opposite of that kind of anger. It's not about others, it's about us. We burn hot over petty offenses to our own honor that we barely blink when God is dishonored. One of my mentors, Dr. Robert Jones, puts it well. He wrote a book about righteous anger, and he says it has 3 marks. Righteous anger, it reacts to actual sin. It focuses on God's kingdom, not our own. And it expresses itself in godly, controlled ways. Godly, controlled ways. By that definition, by that measure, is most of what we call righteous anger actually righteous anger?
No. No way.
So how do we apply this? Let me take the coldest version of anger as an example. Bitterness. Bitterness is just cold anger. It's something that you've had a long time. You've been holding on to it. Chaucer called it old wrath. Something that happened a long time ago, but you never let it go. And the danger is that bitterness breaks fellowship with God. That the bitter person refuses to release his brother or sister from sin's debt because he has exalted himself to the judge. You have made yourself the judge of what is right and what is wrong, and you are now holding that person in prison, and it's creating this anger and this bitterness in you. But here's the thing. Bitterness is a prison. It's self-destructive. It's spiritual suicide. The bitter person drinks a vial of poison and waits for their enemy to die. Jones again reminds us that when we're sinfully angry, we are playing God. We're making ourselves the lawgiver, the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. So the bitter person at the root is really struggling with an idolatry issue. God is no longer God in their life. They are now God. They are now the one who is the lawgiver, who is the judge, and who is the executioner. Instead of letting God be God, they have put their self in the place of God. They are struggling with idolatry. Because there's only one lawgiver. There's only one judge. And that's God. Step 3. This is, again, it just keeps getting more difficult. Verses 23 through 24, we need to go to the offended brother. Jesus says a disciple takes initiative in reconciliation where he has given offense. He takes initiative. Now, Jesus takes this somewhere that I think surprises most people, because we need to read this carefully, because this is where people, I think, often drift if we're not very precise here. Listen to what Jesus doesn't say first. He doesn't say, if you have something against your brother, go. That's not what he's saying. He says, if your brother has something against you, go. The Christians sometimes, they're like, I know that if I have a problem with my brother, then I must go to him and I need to work it out. And that's true. That is absolutely true. But that's not what he's saying here. What he's saying here is, if you have something against your brother, but if your brother has something against you, you need to go. And that direction matters. Jesus is pressing us beyond simply managing our own feelings. He's calling us to take responsibility for the ways that we have disrupted peace in the body. If there is a breach, if a brother has a legitimate grievance against you, Jesus says to you, do not wait for him to come to you. You go. You go. Notice the text assumes that not every accusation is valid. Not every grievance is righteous. Scripture's clear that each person is responsible for their own heart before God. We're not accountable for another person's sinful anger or their distorted judgment. But if there is a real offense, if we have contributed to the fracture, if there is something that should be made right, then we are responsible to move toward the reconciliation. Bloomberg noticed that something against you implies, or likely implies, a just claim, a real issue, not just hypersensitivity here. That matters because Jesus is not calling us to chase down every imagined grievance. You know what I'm talking about? There's those people that just everything hurts their feelings. Just you didn't look at them, you didn't talk to them, I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. Right? That's not what the text is talking about. It's talking about when you actually did something to damage or fracture the relationship. When there was real sin or real harm. And then look at the urgency. He says, you're at the altar. In other words, right now where you're sitting in this very moment, you're in the middle of worship, you brought your gift before God, and in that moment you remember something is broken between you and your brother. Jesus says, stop what you're doing. Stop. The equivalent this morning would be you being convicted by this message and getting up right now, walking outside and calling whoever it is you need to call. Go, be reconciled, and then come back and worship. One commentator pointed out that reconciliation in the kingdom community is so important, it takes priority over worship. As long as there is sin in the church between members, worship is compromised. Now that doesn't mean that reconciliation replaces worship. It means unresolved sin disrupts worship. Does that make sense? God's not, again, honored by outward devotion, just you coming and going through the motions. While inwardly you're refusing to deal with what you know is broken. So what does obedience look like here? Well, it looks like owning sin without excuse. You can't use the word if, but, or maybe. Right? You ever had somebody come to you and they apologize and say, I'm really sorry I got angry with you, but just ignore everything they said before that. Right? Because they don't really mean it. There's some excuse, there's some reason why they reacted the way they reacted. So we got to own our sin without excuse. Refuse to minimize it. Refuse to minimize the harm that we've caused. Well, it's not that bad. Wasn't that big of a deal? No, put yourself in their place. Try to imagine what it must have felt like for them when you offended them and sinned against them. Third, we move toward the person, not away from the person. Sadly, that's not the tendency, though, of most people I know. They don't want to be reminded of their mistake, so they just avoid the person. They're in Publix, and they see them on the other side of the store, and they go the other way, hoping that they never have to cross paths with them. The Christian should move toward the person, not away from the person. Fourth, it looks like seeking obedience even when it costs you your pride. Seeking obedience even when it costs you your pride. See, I think the reason why a lot of us don't go is we think we're right. We think we got this figured out. And pride is such a sneaky sin in our life. Me and Brian were in a meeting the other day, and this guy was railing against a certain politician because he thought that politician didn't have a good understanding of the way the world really worked. And so he was sitting there saying that this politician is so prideful, he's just caught up in his own world, and he thinks he knows what's going on and what it should be. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself the whole time, but you think you know how the world should be. See how sneaky pride is? He's railing against the pride in others while at the same time committing the same pride because he thinks in his little tiny world he's got it all figured out and that politician is doing it the wrong way. It's so easy to fall into the trap of pride. But seeking peace, we do it even when it costs us our pride. And sometimes that cost is steep. It means initiating a conversation you have been avoiding for years. It may be admitting you were wrong when you'd much rather defend yourself. It may mean stepping into some awkwardness and misunderstanding and even ultimately rejection. They may not receive it. But this is the way of the gospel, guys. Reconciliation is at the heart of the gospel. God took the initiative in Christ to restore fallen humanity back to relationship to himself. God didn't wait for us to get our act together to send Jesus. He moved toward us while we were still sinners. And that shapes how we as followers of Jesus are to move toward others. Now again, I want to be clear because this matters for wisdom and for care. You're not responsible for how another person responds. You can't force reconciliation. You can't guarantee peace. Paul says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Right. Paul acknowledges that we're not responsible for the way they respond. We're only responsible to go. So my question for you this morning is, have you taken honest ownership where you've sinned against others? Have you made a sincere effort to pursue peace with that person? Because the disciple of Jesus is not going to sit back and say, well, if they have a problem, they can come to me. That's not being a disciple of Jesus. A disciple goes, not because it's easy, not because it always works, but because that's exactly what Jesus Christ has done for them. And that leads me to step 4. If it wasn't hard enough to go to our brothers, Jesus now says to go to our enemies. You see, the disciple pursues peace even with their enemies. And this is that final step that takes us to the top of the mountain. the apex, the hardest step in this process. And again, I want to remind you of the scent here. Stop the act, stop the attitude, make peace with your angry brother, and finally, make peace even with your enemies. Jesus paints a picture of two people walking into court. There's this lawsuit. There's a debt. And Jesus says, settle it now. Settle it on the way, because once the judge gets involved, you have no chance. You'll have to pay every last penny. Now, to be clear, Jesus is not giving us practical legal advice here. He's using the courtroom as a metaphor for something eternal. Keener points out, when one damages one's relationships with others, one damages one's relationship with God, leading to eternal consequences. And that's what Jesus is trying to get us to see in this metaphor of the courtroom. As Christians, we're responsible even to prevent murder in our enemies. To make peace if we can, whether it's with a beloved brother or a sworn enemy, it doesn't matter. Paul says in Romans 12:18, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone, not just your brothers and sisters in Christ. Your enemies too. And he concedes it may be impossible, but peace requires two people, and you have to try. You got to exhaust every option before you walk away, as far as it depends on you. This Friday I attended a lecture on medieval vices and virtues, and the author that wrote, she wrote a chapter on wrath and meekness, and she put it this way, and I thought it was so good. It said, the truly meek person chooses to suffer rather than inflict violence. The meek do not wilt under pressure. They refuse to return violence. And meekness, the author says, is especially a virtue for the powerful. The more power you have, the more dangerous your anger. You're in a family, your dad, that anger you have is really dangerous, because God has put you in the position of head of your family. And if you're walking around angry at the world all the time, I guarantee you're taking that out on your wife. You're taking that out on your son. You're taking that out on your daughter. And that's why it's so dangerous. The more powerful you are. I know a lot of you are sitting there thinking, well, damn, I'm not that powerful. I just work a normal job. But to somebody, you're powerful. And that's why we have to be so careful when it comes to our anger. The meek are the only ones who can be trusted with real authority, because they've refused to let wrath govern them. There's a quote from Frederick Bochner that I want to leave you with. He said, one of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. Anger is possibly the most fun. It licks your wounds to smack your lips over grievances long past, to savor both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that you are wolfing down yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. That's the cost of unresolved anger. You're destroying yourself. Not just the relationship, but you are destroying yourself. That's why, listen guys, we live in a world full of what they call rage bait. There's a whole genre of podcast and social media, Instagram reels and TikToks that the whole purpose is to make you angry. They will say the most crazy, outlandish things to get you angry so that you will go and watch. And they will do that over and over and over and over again until you are just a ball of rage. We need to be careful what we're consuming in this current culture that we live in. Because anger ultimately, it damages relationships, but it ultimately is damaging you. And we have an enemy that loves to what? Kill, steal, and destroy. And when you walk around full of anger, he doesn't have to do anything with you. You're stealing, killing, and destroying yourself, ultimately. But if you're married, if you're a boss and own a business, you're also destroying other people's lives and relationships as well. Jesus is calling us to walk 4 hard steps up a mountain. Stopping the act, stopping the attitude, pursuing the offended brother, pursuing the enemy. And I think by the time Jesus is done, most of us should realize we have been failing on multiple fronts simultaneously. We have contempt toward people that we have nursed for years. We have relationships that we have let wither and die because going first felt like losing. And we refused to be a loser or to feel like one. We've got enemies that we told ourselves that we would never, ever forgive. But let me end with the good news. And I always want to land here because this is where the gospel is. The same Jesus who gives these commands also just said a few verses before, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He gives these commands to people who cannot keep them. And he gave his life as a ransom for disciples who failed him daily. Jesus doesn't just give us the law, he gives us himself. He's the only one who perfectly kept these commandments, never harbored contempt, never refused to pursue peace. Even when dragged to the courtroom, to Pilate's court, he was silent. Even when they crucified him, he was praying for his enemies. He walked, step 4, all the way to the cross. And now, because of what he did, we have his spirit, we have his righteousness, and we have the power to begin, just begin, to live this way. The question this morning is not whether you've murdered anyone. According to this text, we all have. The question is whether you're willing to do the hard, costly, slow work of being a peacemaker. Not a passive non-murderer, but an active pursuer of peace. This morning, will you go first? Will you go to your brother? Will you go to your enemy? That is what Jesus is asking of us in this text. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for sending your Son to die for us. Because there's no way that we could possibly fulfill this law. But we praise you and thank you for coming and fulfilling it perfectly, even to the cross.